A good day's beginning. Paul Whitaker prided himself on knowing every crack in the tiles of his office's break room. 10 years of arriving early, always with a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand, he liked the routine, the sense of order in small patterns. Today was no different. The low hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint scent of lemon cleanser, the sunlight inching across the gray carpet. Everything about Monday morning felt perfectly familiar. He greeted Marcia at reception with his usual half-smile. Marcia liked to bring in homemade cookies, and Paul always made it a point to compliment her. Today, it was oatmeal raisin, his favorite. "Smells like a bakery in here," he quipped, earning a wide, motherly grin from the older woman. The office was still half empty at 8:30. Soft laughter floated from accounting, and in the mailroom, someone played classic rock just a little too loud. Paul settled into his cubicle. He ran his finger over the framed photo of his 2 daughters on his desk, a small ritual for motivation before opening his inbox. The routine was comforting until, around 9, Supervising Manager Clara Parker called for a staff meeting. Something in her voice, a tad too brisk, made Paul's stomach clench. He saw heads pop up over fabric-covered partitions, curious and anxious. They gathered in the glass-walled conference room. Clara stood at the head, her posture unusually stiff. "I want everyone to welcome our new general manager, Mr. Harrison Lewis." The door opened. Harrison strode in, tall and sharply dressed, every detail calculated. The perfect knot in his silk tie, polished Oxfords reflecting the fluorescent lights, teeth white in a tight, business-like smile. Paul noted the man's gaze, assessing, direct, but with an undercurrent of distance. Harris looked less like someone joining a family and more like a surgeon arriving for an operation. "Thank you, Clara," Harrison began, his voice smooth but cold. "I'm here to help the company move forward, efficiently and profitably. I expect dedication and adaptability." As Paul packed up that night, the office was still and silent. It would never feel quite routine again, not with Harrison Lewis pacing the halls and every employee's future suddenly uncertain. A shift in the air. By the end of his first week, Harrison Lewis had already left a trail of unease in his wake. The office, once a place where inside jokes and personal favors softened the flow of work, began to feel colder, tighter. A dial turned just a notch too far. Paul sensed it on Tuesday morning as he walked in. The overhead lights seemed harsher, scattering sharp angles across the open floor. The copy machine's endless grinding now felt less like white noise and more like a countdown. It wasn't just him. Marcia's cheerful greetings had become muted, her tray of cookies left mostly untouched on the counter. The new rules started small. No more music in the mailroom, no more long breaks, and all personal calls strictly limited. "It's just about discipline," Harrison announced at the daily stand-up, his eyes flickering from employee to employee, missing nothing. "Efficiency is the foundation of success." Paul noticed how Harrison's steps never paused. He made a habit of stopping unexpectedly at desks, glancing at screens, asking sharp, quick questions. "How's that report coming, Paul? Are you ahead of schedule?" Never waiting for a full answer, already moving on. The man carried a faint scent of expensive cologne and something sharper, intangible. Meetings grew longer, but friendlier conversations evaporated. Lisa from HR confided to Paul during one of their hasty, whispered chats by the water cooler. He asked for everyone's performance metrics for the last 6 months. I've never seen someone read so fast or so thoroughly. Lunch breaks lost their laughter. Staff huddled in corners muttering about efficiency targets and possible layoffs, while Harrison retreated into his office with the blinds drawn and a phone pressed tight to his ear. Even the sunlight slanting through the windows felt sterile now, trapped in a space where everything was under new scrutiny. Paul tried to keep his head down, else we're just ticking along, waiting for the axe to drop. By Friday, the old rhythm of comfort and predictability had vanished. Where there had once been trust, now there was worry. Where there was laughter, only tension. A shift in the air, palpable, inescapable, had settled over everything. And Paul, who had believed he knew this place inside and out, suddenly felt like a stranger in his own home. Seeds of doubt. March ended with a gray drizzle and a mood that matched the sky. Paul thought himself immune to workplace anxiety. After all these years, he'd seen good bosses and bad, storms and sunshine. But something about Harrison's approach was different, as if the man didn't just navigate rough waters, but preferred to stir them up. The week started with an all-hands email. I expect staff to demonstrate initiative and accept new assignments regardless of previous roles. Flexibility is essential to our success. It sounded simple, but it signaled, subtly but unmistakably, that the old boundaries between job descriptions were about to disappear. On Tuesday morning, Paul was surprised to find a thick manila envelope on his desk. Inside was a stack of unfamiliar paperwork, inventory forms, vendor correspondence, and budget spreadsheets for a project in a department he'd never worked. On a yellow sticky note, scrawled in Harrison's sharp, slanted letters, "Organize and summarize by Friday, urgent." Paul looked around, searching for an explanation, but everyone else seemed just as bewildered by their own mysterious new tasks. Some even whispered that additional, urgent assignments had them working through lunch or late into the night. That afternoon, Clara, their old manager, stopped Paul in the hallway. "It's a test," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Harrison wasn't lurking. "He wants to see who sinks and who swims." Paul stayed late, hunched over the numbers, but things didn't add up. Vendor invoices contained hidden fees. Some budgets had odd gaps, thousands unaccounted for. At first, he thought it was careless bookkeeping, but the deeper he dug, the more deliberate it felt. His years of experience told him these were not simple mistakes. Wednesday, as he was sorting through another round of unreadable spreadsheets, fairness. But doubt had found its way in, rooting deep. When he drove home under the blinking streetlights, headlights catching a spray of rain, Paul realized he'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't about going above and beyond for the company anymore. It was about finding out whether all this efficiency was really just a smokescreen for something much darker. And in that moment, Paul understood two things. He couldn't let this go. And whatever he found, things at the office would never be the same again. Quiet sacrifices. Paul's days started earlier now. He was the first to park in the cold, shadowed lot out back, long before sunlight touched the faded lines on the asphalt. The building was still locked and silent most mornings, but Paul relished the brief solitude, the hum of fluorescent lights blinking awake as he clicked on his computer, line by line, reviewing the tangled numbers that filled his mind, even in sleep. The project Harrison had assigned him was eating up every spare minute. Paul felt as if he were unraveling not merely spreadsheets, but something woven deeper. Intentional gaps, sly overstatements, misfiled invoices that, piece by piece, began to form a pattern he couldn't quite see but couldn't ignore. The once familiar faces at the office seemed more distant each day. Joe stopped popping by with jokes. Marcia's cookies vanished untouched. Paul caught glances from colleagues, their pity thinly concealed by fatigue and their own creeping workloads. Most just kept their heads down, quietly grateful Paul had become Harrison's favorite target. Even at home, Paul's world shrank around him. Jenna greeted him with soft concern in her eyes. "You're not sleeping, Paul," she observed one evening as she set down dinner and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "Is everything okay at work?" "It's just a busy period," he lied, pushing food around his plate with his fork. "Things will calm down." But he saw her watching, tracing the crease that now lived permanently between his brows. Out before dawn or shuffled in well after dark. One Friday after midnight, Paul finally closed his laptop, the screen awash in the blue glow that left his eyes stinging. The house was silent. Jenna and the girls long ago retreated to the comfort of sleep. For the first time, Paul wondered if the cost of keeping up with Harrison's demands was more than missed dinners and restless nights. He wondered what would be left of him and his family if he didn't find a way back. But come morning, he would put on his collared shirt and brave the office again, quietly bearing the weight of his sacrifices on shoulders that felt heavier with every passing day. The first blow. By Monday, Paul's exhaustion felt like a second skin. He could sense something was about to snap, but he kept moving, half on instinct, half on the hope that steady work would shield him from the building storm. The office was eerily quiet when Paul arrived. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, measuring out the dread that seemed to fill every corner. There was an urgent email from Clara. "Mandatory meeting in conference room A. Attend immediately." No subject, no explanation. Paul went, shuffling into the glass-walled space already buzzing with low whispers. Most of the staff had already gathered, faces tense with worry. Harrison stood at the front, expression unreadable, hands folded neatly across a stack of printed reports. When everyone arrived, Harrison cleared his throat. "As you all know, we recently completed a crucial phase for the Barnes project, one with tremendous importance for our long-term prospects." His gaze swept the room. Then the bomb dropped. "Unfortunately, our reporting has uncovered a series of significant errors in the project's execution and documentation," Harrison said, voice crisp, cutting through the silence. "It's led to delays, budget overruns, and serious concerns from our board. The responsibility for these failures," he paused, locking eyes with Paul, "lies with those directly overseeing the financial and organizational aspects. Paul, you were in charge of this report, correct?" Paul's mouth sat alone for a moment, heart pounding. He wanted to protest, wanted to shout about the impossible deadlines and the errors that hadn't even been his, but the words felt useless in the face of such public condemnation. Back at his desk, Paul stared down at his shaking hands. Emails poured in, queries about the project, HR notifications, a curt note from Harrison. "Please clear your schedule for our meeting at 3 p.m. Each message felt heavier than the last. All afternoon he replayed the meeting in his mind. The humiliation gnawed at him, undermining the confidence that had anchored him for so long. A few co-workers mustered awkward attempts at comfort, but Paul could sense the undercurrent. if Harrison could take down someone like him, no one was safe. His mind spun between anger, shame, and disbelief. He wondered how much Harrison really knew, whether his own mistakes had truly triggered this, or if he was just the most convenient scapegoat. When the day ended, Paul gathered his things in silence, afraid to look anyone in the eye. Even the photograph of his daughters seemed to accuse him. What if he lost this job? What if everything he'd sacrificed had been for nothing? The world felt smaller, meaner, and far less certain than just a week before. But somewhere, beneath the shame, a different feeling began to smolder. A sense of injustice and resentment that would soon ignite into something much harder to contain. Under the surface. Hode. The days after the meeting bled together into a haze of paperwork and whispered conversations. On probation, Paul's responsibilities shrank to only the most routine tasks: updating files, reviewing spreadsheets prepared by others, answering terse emails sent by Clara or, worse, Harrison himself. If anyone had doubted the new general manager's authority before, they didn't anymore. Paul felt invisible and yet watched. A curious, exhausting paradox. Each morning he walked into a room that seemed to hold its breath until Harrison's footsteps echoed down the hall or his voice cut through the office stillness. Gossip swirled just out of Paul's earshot, while colleagues he used to joke with ducked their heads or found some reason to busy themselves. Tension etched on her face, but she gestured for him to come in. "I need your help," Paul blurted before he could lose his nerve. He explained everything: the misallocated funds, the incomplete vendor reports, the endless deadlines that left no room for real accuracy. Clara listened quietly, nodding at the part she recognized. "You're not the first person he's targeted," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But people are scared, Paul. No one wants to be next." Paul leaned forward. "We can't be the only ones who see what's happening. Someone must have proof, a record of how he sets up scapegoats or manipulates the books." Clara hesitated. "There are files, old HR reports from Oregon and Nebraska. I kept copies on the server just in case, but you have to be careful if Harrison realizes you're looking." "I know," Paul said, his voice tight. "But if we do nothing, we're trapped. I won't let him use me or anyone else as cover for whatever he's planning here." They made a pact. Clara would discreetly send him what she could find. Paul would keep his head down and play the loyal employee until they gathered enough evidence. If nothing else, they owed it to the one still afraid to speak out. Late that night, at his kitchen table, Paul opened the first of Clara's encrypted emails. Internal memos, warnings ignored, exit interviews from employees half a country away. The pattern was plain as day. Targets chosen, mistakes magnified, careers ended. His heart pounded, a strange mix of dread and purpose sharpening his resolve. He knew the risks, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to hope. Whatever happened next, Paul had made his choice. He would not go quietly. Lines in the sand. The next week dawned thick with uncertainty, spring rains pelting the city with ceaseless drumming that seemed to echo the tension at the office. Paul began to perfect a new routine. He showed up on time, did the work Harrison assigned, and answered each pointed question with clipped efficiency. But behind that careful mask, a current of urgency swept him along. Paul and Clara communicated only in brief encounters or through encrypted emails late at night. Every plugged in the drive. The files Clara had copied over were both exhilarating and terrifying. Personnel complaints from across multiple branches, audit trails with signatures that didn't match, emails showing Harrison pressing for approvals from underqualified staff. Buried in a folder labeled Archives was a single spreadsheet tracking turnover rates, 2 to 3 times the industry average in every office Harrison had managed. Paul's pulse hammered in his ears. This wasn't just corporate pressure or tight management. It was a calculated operation, a way to cull staff and claim efficiency while pinning the chaos on anyone too slow to scramble. The next day, he and Clara met in the stairwell. "There's a pattern," Paul said quietly. "It's always the same story, just with different names. And every time there's pushback, he builds a case first. Paper trails, sudden policy changes, impossible assignments. Then comes the public blame." Clara looked tired but determined. "If we're going to stop this, we need more. Something that ties him directly to the board. If he's protecting someone or getting a bonus for all this efficiency, that's our leverage." That night, Paul barely slept. Every shadow outside their bedroom window seemed to hold a threat, every creak in the house a warning. For the first time in his career, work wasn't just a source of pride or stability. It felt like hostile territory, every step forward a risk, every conversation coded. But as the week wore on, something changed. Paul noticed glances exchanged between other employees, whispered rumors that Clara wasn't the only one who saw through Harrison's act. He caught Lisa from HR eyeing a stack of policy memos, lips pressed thin with suspicion. Joe made a point of lingering in the break room, locking eyes with Paul in silent, desperate solidarity. Lines were being drawn in the sand, quietly but unmistakably. Paul's isolation shifted into a fragile sense of alliance, one based less on trust and more on shared necessity. He understood then. The choice was no longer about saving his job. Small signs of quiet rebellion surfaced among the staff. Lisa from HR started leaving cryptic post-it notes behind for Paul. "See page 12," or "Check travel logs March to April." Joe and Marcia, once withdrawn, began looping Paul and Clara into conversations about policy clarifications. On the surface, it all looked routine, but the air in the building pulsed with new, nervous energy. Midweek, Paul found himself in the elevator with Lisa. No cameras in there, Clara had confirmed. Lisa glanced at him, voice low. "Clara filled me in. I have records, termination packages, board memos, and contact info for a reporter who's covered this before. But we have to be smart. If we go to HR first, Harrison will bury everything and make it look like we're the problem." Paul nodded, the frustration and adrenaline making his fingers tremble. They agreed to meet at Lisa's apartment that night, a location away from prying office eyes. After work, Paul texted Jenna that he'd be home late, something about a late project review. The lie burned on his tongue, but the alternative, a sudden, panicked shutdown of the whole operation, was worse. Lisa's apartment was small, neat, and smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. The kitchen table became their war room. Clara arrived minutes later, a battered folder in hand. They spread out documents, charting the puzzle. HR complaints that mysteriously vanished, sudden transfers to nowhere postings, emails with stilted, legal-sounding language following each incident, an expense report linking Harrison to private meetings with a board member infamous for cutting costs by any means necessary. As they worked, a plan began to form. They would organize the evidence, create a dossier so compelling that legal or the press couldn't ignore it. There'd be risk. Careers, reputations. More than that if Harrison had powerful friends out of sight. But by midnight, resolve had set across the table like concrete. When Paul returned home, exhaustion clouded his mind. But for the first time in weeks, last resort. But one more people were willing to risk. Paul realized that what had started as self-preservation had become a fight for justice, maybe even survival. They no longer doubted Harrison's methods or cynicism. The only question was if they could move fast enough, together, to drag the truth into the light. As he walked home through the thinning rain, Paul glanced up at the streetlights, their glow blurred and unsteady on the pavement. He wasn't sure what the next days would bring. For now, standing beneath the storm, he drew strength from the knowledge that he wasn't standing alone. On the edge. By Friday morning, tension in the office felt electric. Every whispered conversation, every lingering glance charged with expectation. Paul sensed the air shift the moment he walked in, the hum of nervous energy barely disguised behind the click of keyboards and the shuffling of files. Harrison prowled the floor more frequently now, his questions masking suspicion behind a veneer of routine check-ins. Paul, Clara, and Lisa continued their delicate dance. Each avoided spending too much time together, favoring plausible deniability over open alliance. In private, they honed their dossier, tightening facts, cross-referencing dates, and carefully plotting their next moves. The temptation to strike grew with every passing day, but so did the risk. Mid-morning, Harrison called Paul into his office. "Sit down," Harrison said, his voice deceptively casual. His office, immaculate and cold, was a far cry from the chaos of the open floor. "You've been quiet lately, Whitaker. That's good, but I expect more initiative from you during probation if you want this job." Paul nodded, careful to mask his anxiety. He clasped his hands just tightly enough to hide their tremor. Harrison leaned forward. "You know, sometimes employees get confused. They start chasing problems that aren't there. I need people who are loyal, who keep their heads down. If you're thinking of causing trouble, I suggest you reconsider." Paul met his gaze. "I'm just here to work," speaking in quick, low tones over bad coffee. "We need to deliver the dossier now," Clara insisted. "If Harrison pulls up our searches, we're finished." Lisa nodded. "I spoke to the reporter. She's ready. If anything happens, she'll release the story, documents and all." Paul weighed the urgency against caution. "We do this, there's no going back. We could lose everything, or bring it all crashing down on Harrison." Silence hung between them, heavy as the threat looming over their heads. But the decision was made. Saturday morning, Paul arrived early at the law office recommended by Lisa's contact, dossier clutched tight beneath his raincoat. Every step across the marble lobby echoed with years of dignity, a stark contrast to the secrets festering back at work. He turned over their compiled evidence to the firm's investigator, watching the man's eyes widen as he flipped through the pages. "This is enough to force internal inquiry," he said quietly. "More than enough, if the board has any sense of self-preservation." Paul left the building feeling a weight both lifted and pressing harder. As he emerged onto the street, the sky had cleared at last, morning sunlight slipping between tall towers, sharpening the city's edges. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but also, at last, aligned with something right. Back at the office come Monday, nothing outwardly changed. But Paul saw the wary looks Harrison sent his way, the uncertain gestures between management and HR. The storm he and his friends had unleashed was only just beginning. If fear and hope had once warred inside Paul, they now forged him into someone new. A man willing to stand on the edge for the truth, even when he had no idea what the fall might cost. Cracks in the facade. The world felt subtly altered as Paul walked into the office on Monday. The sunlight filtered differently through the windows, casting sharp-edged shadows across the worn carpet, and every conversation seemed to stop the moment he passed by. He knew the dossier was making its way through the channels of power now, passed quietly from legal to simply tried to breathe, to remind himself he was still standing. Every instinct screamed danger, but a quieter voice, one he hadn't heard in years, answered, "You did the right thing." An hour later, the building seemed to vibrate with tension. Employees gathered in pairs and clusters, discussing rumors and fragments. Marcia brought Paul coffee, her hands trembling. "They're saying the board confronted him. Legal's in there too," she whispered. "Lisa says it sounded heated." A thud of heavy footsteps broke the hush. Harrison emerged from the boardroom, face red, jaw tight with fury. He didn't look at anyone as he stormed to his office, slamming the door so hard the framed pictures rattled. All across the floor, people exchanged glances. Fear, relief, and curiosity tangled together. Not an hour later, Clara appeared at Paul's desk. Her manner was almost too casual. "The board wants to see you. Conference room B." Paul's heart hammered, but he squared his shoulders and rose. As he walked the corridor, faces peeked out from around doorways, some afraid, some supportive, all watching. Inside, the board sat in careful silence, a half-circle of expensive suits and polished shoes. Legal counsel sat at one end, a stack of paper in front of them. Harrison's seat was empty. One board member, a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Whitaker, we've reviewed the evidence you submitted. Can you confirm these documents are accurate and explain what prompted your actions?" Paul cleared his throat. Truth came easier now, like breath. "I couldn't let a pattern of targeting and intimidation go on, not when it was hurting the company and everyone who works here. I was afraid, but I had help. People trusted me with the truth. I only hope this will be enough to make it stop." The board members exchanged glances, some grudgingly impressed, some still wary of scandal. The woman spoke again. "Thank you for your courage. The board will take appropriate action. There will be no retaliation against you or any cooperating staff. Go back." Wasn't finished. There would be fallout, investigations, maybe new villains. But for now, beneath the glow of late afternoon sun, Paul allowed himself a rare gift: hope. Solid, resilient, shining like gold at the end of a long, hard tunnel. After the storm. The building felt lighter the next morning, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that only those who had lived through the months of dread could sense. Paul arrived early, unsure what to expect. Harrison was gone. Offices that had once been hushed and anxious now buzzed with a cautious kind of hope, like a house slowly waking after a long, oppressive night. People smiled at each other again, even if the smiles were brief and a little uncertain. Joe brought in coffee and donuts for everyone, cracking shy jokes in the break room. Marcia, still wide-eyed, wandered the halls distributing leftover cake from her daughter's birthday, laughing more freely than Paul had ever heard. But the relief was tempered by a sense of waiting. The board had promised no retaliation, but old habits are hard to shake. Paul caught traces of wariness in the way conversations stopped or hushed when a senior manager walked by. More than once, he saw Lisa glancing over her shoulder, or Clara hesitating before sending an email. Trust had to be rebuilt, and when trust is broken, it never returns quite the same. On Wednesday, the board circulated a company-wide announcement. It was written in careful, measured language. Following a thorough review of recent leadership and personnel decisions, the board is making organizational changes to create a workplace built on respect, accountability, and inclusion. We encourage any employee with concerns or suggestions to come forward and affirm that no action will be taken against those who have spoken up. For the first time, it didn't ring entirely hollow. Later that day, Paul was asked to attend a town hall-style meeting in the conference room. Rows of chairs were filled with nervous employees. Clara, Lisa, and Marcia sat together near the front. A board member spoke briefly about the transition, then the floor opened for questions. At first, no one changes took root. Employees suggested new training programs. Managers were scheduled for listening sessions. A poster by the elevator invited feedback, anonymously if needed. Paul took on extra work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to help shape what came next. Some nights, as he walked to his car beneath the clean, bright glow of office lights, he thought about how close he had come to giving up, to letting fear win. Now the fear wasn't gone, but it was no longer alone. Hope lived beside it, stronger every day. The scars would remain, reminders of how fragile trust, security, and dignity could be. But as Paul looked around the lively, recovering office, he knew that the scars could also be the start of something new. A place not only mended, but stitched together by the shared courage of everyone who refused to be silent. The storm had passed, but what grew in its wake was entirely up to them. New beginnings. The days stretched into weeks, and although change was slow, it was unmistakable. The company, still reeling from the scandal's aftershocks, pressed on toward something more honest and resilient. Paul found himself growing into a new version of himself. He was still deliberate and careful, but the fear that had once dogged his every step no longer dictated his choices. Now, when he spoke in meetings or offered a suggestion, people listened, not just politely, but with genuine interest. Clara was promoted to oversee a revamped compliance team. Her resilience and even-handedness made her both respected and fiercely defended by her staff. She took pride in setting up channels for anonymous feedback and making sure no concern, however small, vanished into the void. Sometimes after work, she and Paul would sit in the break room, sharing stories of small victories. A resolved complaint, a timid intern finding their own voice. Lisa found an unlikely role as a bridge between departments. Her understanding of policies and her calm, practical wisdom soothed nerves and diffused old rivalries. She invited Paul and Marcia to join a committee tasked with redesigning the company's onboarding process, this time with ethics and empathy at the center. They'd uncovered before. Each check-in brought with it a little more trust, a little less dread. The walls Harrison had built of silence, suspicion, and divide were coming down, replaced with windows and bridges. Late one afternoon, Paul was surprised to find the board member with silver-streaked hair standing beside the break room window, gazing out at the city. She turned as he approached. "You know, Mr. Whitaker, organizations don't change because rules say so. They change because people care enough to hold us to account. Thank you for not giving up." Paul shook his head, humbled. "It wasn't just me." "No, it never is," she agreed with a small smile. As summer turned the city bright and green, Paul walked the halls with a lighter step. The company was hardly perfect, there were still frustrations, and the work could still be heavy, but something essential had shifted. People made mistakes and owned them. When someone stumbled, hands reached out, not to harm, but to help. One evening, as he packed up to leave, Paul caught a reflection of himself in the glass. Older, perhaps, but somehow freer than he'd been in years. He thought of the team, Clara, Lisa, Marcia, and all the others who'd stood up when it mattered most. Their names might never appear in annual reports or press releases, but their courage was etched in the new culture they were building every day. Hope, he realized, was not a guarantee. It was a choice you made, sometimes in the face of all reason, again and again. And this time, he chose it gladly.